thanks for convening everybody and making the switch, like all of us have, to this brand new world of online engagement. And thank you all for joining. This is the first for me in a virtual lecture. I've done pre-recorded talks before, but never a live lecture, so I'm really excited about this. I'm going to talk about three main themes for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. As a lawyer in a past life, I can talk, with a mouthful of marbles underwater. So discipline myself to stick within that, because these lunchtime series, if we were doing them in person, they're really about a conversation. I'm hoping that even though we're not in physical proximity, we can still foster that in conversation feel about this. And so I'll leave some time to do that. So the three sort of key factors or key pillars that will underpin some points I want to make about climate change and how we go forward are really centred on how we think about our current versus our future world. I then want to say a few things about systems risk and systems approaches to big interrelated problems like climate change, but equally the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. And then I'm going to say a few things about how we treat experts and the importance of having experts, scientific experts, at the centre of decision making in that context. So coming to the first point about our current versus future world, this has been in my diary for a few months. So when this first landed in my diary, the thinking of current world was just after bushfires, and for Canberra, just after months of living through significant air pollution and really seeing some momentum building around climate change and the importance of government and policy responses as well as other sectors. And then we got hit with a pandemic. So the current world that I was imagining at the start of this topic has already changed to a new current world. And we're seeing some really interesting and important discussions starting to happen around the world on what a future world will look like post-pandemic. And there's more than two camps, but I'm going to be a little bit binary and say that there are two broad camps around this. One is that we will return back to normal, however that is defined, but I've assumed and looked at some of that rhetoric and conversations and perspectives, and it really is a return to flying around the world, having many meetings in person, often meetings that could be an email. For those who know me well will know that I absolutely abhor having meetings where there's not decisions that need to be made. Let's just call it lunch and do lunch instead. And this idea of consuming and living a life that's taking more than we give back, versus this other strand or way of thinking about our relationship with the planet and with each other, which is that we have a real opportunity now to rethink and transform society. And that's significant. We talk about it as academics. We say things like, well, if we apply these theories like systems theory, we can transform society and we can all work together and it's going to be fantastic. But you need significant trigger points to achieve that. And it's possible that the bushfires could have been that trigger point, but maybe not. Now we have a global pandemic and the whole world is thinking about, well, what does it mean to live in a global society? What does it mean to recover from this? And do we want to recover from this in a way that takes us back to where we were before? Or do we want to recover from this and start to think about different types of societies and different ways of being together? And that's important because we as human beings have really constructed a world that is quite untenable. We run mostly on complacency. We live day to day, sometimes month to month, or a few years ahead for the most part. The current system demands that we consume to keep it going, to keep growth growing, to keep the economy and to keep our society functioning. And it demands that we do that so that we get a benefit from that. So this system that we've created is quite individualised and quite inward-looking. And I would put that this is not only untenable, but it makes us focus too far away from who we are as community, as a community species, and how we interact with each other. And the fact that we've all been not forced, but we've been strongly encouraged and in some states really forced to self-isolate has really brought home the fact that we are a social species and we need each other and we need that sense of community, and we need to be thinking about that in terms of our relationship with the planet, and measuring things like health and well-being as the growth things that we should be thinking about, as opposed to GDP and endless consuming of resources and other things. A lot of people would have thought that that was pie in the sky thinking even 3 months ago, but a pandemic really forces all of us to take a step back and ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing, and how, and for what end? So that's the sort of thinking around current and future world and how we interact with each other. The second point on systems and risk. The COVID-19 virus or disease and the coronavirus has really taught us very quickly that minimising negative impacts of a systems-wide risk, in this case a pandemic, does demand swift, coordinated, scalable, and quite evolutionary responses from all sectors. And I never would have imagined the day that I would have seen our current Prime Minister on national TV for all of his good points and bad points, but I would never have thought we would see economic stimulus in the way that we are seeing it. It's fabulous policy and I have no criticisms of it, but I just would have never imagined ever that would happen. And here we are. So thinking about systems-wide risk like that and how different sectors respond, it's important, I think, that the cost burden, and there is a cost burden to this, is shared equitably, not just equally, but equitably, and thinking about the vulnerable sectors of our community. And thinking about risk as a system, really recognising all the different parts of our social system. So that's, government and industry and business, but also community groups, ourselves as scientists, for those of us who are scientists, even our roles as parents, how we communicate with teachers, nurses, and all the different parts of our society that make us who we are. Trying to align the system that is our society, all of those factors, in a coordinated and coherent way sounds great. And we've been studying it as academics and scientists for a long time, and we're confident that it's a good way to enable decision making, but it's really hard to do. There are so many different competing interests, and trying to align all of those at the same time is challenging. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it in this way, because if we do that, we create efficiencies and we can get more traction and really take those forward leaps, as opposed to just living in that complacent, responsive way that I was referring to earlier. And that brings me really to the role of science and how experts across all of the sciences, social sciences, the biological and physical sciences and the humanities really play a role in enabling this change. We think about the pandemic and we know that science will solve it one way or another, probably in several ways, with the development of vaccines and in understanding the virus and understanding future potential viruses and things like that. But it's not just those hard sciences that we need. We need public policy people and economists and lawyers and geographers and humanities scholars to help translate that science to communities, to bring people along in that process, and to really think through what it means to be a connected society. And if we translate that to climate change, it's absolutely critical that we engage cross-sectorally. Climate change is such a pervasive and such a long-term challenge for us that we need all the levers activated and we need to know when to pull which lever at which point in time. It's different in that regard to responding to a pandemic like COVID, because that has been a very hard and fast shock to the system and to our global system. And it's illustrated for people that this can be done. Societies can reorient themselves quite quickly when they have to. But climate change will give us those short, sharp shocks like the bushfire responses. But the science of climate change and the way that the response to those shocks is treated still needs some significant work. And in that, we need scientists. We need things like the Prime Minister standing on national TV when there's a crisis like the bushfires with scientific experts and saying, the scientific experts have told me these things, and this is how we as a country are going to respond, in the same way that they are doing now with the pandemic. It gives people confidence in independent expertise. Scientists don't spend 30, 40, 50 years of their lives writing opinions on the internet. They really are the experts, and they should be trusted. And it fosters a trust in science and a trust in democracy and policy when we see our leaders really relying on that. And I think it was mentioned earlier that we saw, those leaders during the bushfires on TV, and people like Shane Fitzsimmons in New South Wales, he just became that trusted authority while everyone tuned in day on day to find out what was happening with the fires, where they were moving, and how people were responding. So I'm going to leave it there because I've just looked at the time and I've got more than 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop. But I hope that some of those thoughts have provoked some questions and some comments in the audience we've got here today. And I'm really looking forward to engaging with you all in a discussion.
Thank you. So I have some slides to share. So we should be good now, I hope. So I wanted to talk through my experience from a climate change perspective and as an expert on climate change, and really focus on that climate issue. So I wanted to start by emphasising that climate change is certainly not a new problem, and it's not a new issue. So this is a figure here that is looking at some of the projections that were made about climate change back in 1990 by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which brings together hundreds of world-leading experts in the physical climate science to provide information for policymakers and government. So when we compare the information that they provided back in 1990 with what has occurred in the meantime, we can see that they really do track very well for what they were suggesting back in 1990. And I also put up these figures, these photos here, which aren't quite from 1990. They might have been a year or two earlier than that, but this is me and this is my older brother who just turned 40 2 days ago. So we can see that this is an extremely well-established issue, and one where experts have been talking on this matter for decades, literally decades. But if we come to now, the physical reality of those graphs, so this is just a line plot showing temperatures increasing over time and what was projected using climate models and theories about climate change. But the reality of that now, being in 2019, 2020, is aspects of what occurred over the last summer. So we had our extraordinary bushfire season, we had heat waves, we've had drought, and I'm not suggesting that every one of those particular extreme events was directly caused by climate change, but we're seeing changes in our climate system that are having horrific impacts on human and social systems. And that's really what we saw with what was going on in terms of firefighting efforts and the incredible sadness of lives lost during our Black Summer. So we have decades of climate experts talking about what we can expect in the future, and now we are living aspects of those projections. But when we look at what's going on in terms of how information that's being provided now by experts is received, we can see that in some ways we might think about this, very little has changed. So these are screenshots that I got off newspaper articles from the summer we've just had. So the New South Wales Deputy Premier says climate change talk amid fire crisis is a disgrace. New South Wales public servants were told not to discuss the link between climate change and bushfires at a conference, and that was a government directive. And then elected representative says New South Wales bushfire victims most likely voted for the Greens, and implied that they were somehow at fault for their own terrible outcomes. So on the backdrop of this physical reality of increases in extreme weather and climate events, particularly extreme heat and bushfires, we see that that expertise has not really infiltrated public understanding or the policy space. And I just wanted to provide a bit of my own perspective on that. So this is screenshots. I haven't had much time to put this together, unfortunately, because of the reality we're all living, where work and life and children and all of that folded in on itself. But these are some screenshots from a blog post I wrote a couple of years back that highlighted some of the snail mail I'd received, but also some of the comments and emails that I'd received as a climate scientist who had spoken in the media about the link between climate change and changing weather and climate extremes in Australia. So there were recommendations that I should kill myself. There were recommendations that that my child should be taken away from me because I wasn't fit to parent. There were many attempts to undermine or dismiss my expertise, either based on gender or more simply that that scientists didn't really have a proper understanding of climate change and these issues. There are people Googling the incorrect Sophie Lewis and then using the other Sophie Lewis's credentials to discredit my discussion of climate change and climate science. So that is my experience, not universally, of course. I also highlighted in these posts how I'd had letters thanking me, and how information that I had provided had been fed to policymakers. So it's not universally negative, but these are, from my perspective, the way that scientific information from climate scientists is still regarded in Australia in terms of our mainstream media and policy landscape. So that brings us to now, and our experience of living through more than one crisis at the one time. So this is a screenshot that I took from ACT Health that was from the 18th of April, so going back a few days now, where we have all pulled together as community in terms of government, and we've managed to limit the number of lives lost to date to COVID-19 in the ACT to 3. This is again a little screenshot from an article that came out about a month ago now, and I have a link down here that you can follow or follow up on if that interests you, that looked at the unprecedented smoke-related health burden associated with our bushfires. So it's very well known that extreme heat waves are Australia's deadliest natural disasters. If we look back at the 2009 bushfires outside of Melbourne, we see that the week-long heat wave that accompanied the Black Saturday bushfires caused twice as many deaths as the fires themselves. So we know that heat is a killer in Australia, but this article also indicated that early estimates suggest at least 31 of our community in Canberra lost their lives due to the smoke. So that horrible smoke that we experienced, that inconvenienced us for months, was related to at least 31 deaths. So I'm not comparing crises and suggesting that one is more important than the other based on the number of lives lost or anything like that. I'm just indicating that we've experienced more than one crisis at the one time, and the ways that we measure them can give us some indication of the severity of what we might face in the future. So I show this curve a lot, and this is a figure showing how temperatures have changed over the globe during the period where the Bureau of Meteorology and other organisations have been measuring temperatures, and then it shows what might happen in the future. And a lot of that is uncertain because we don't know everything about the climate system, we don't know everything about climate models, but we also have a lot of uncertainty based on what decisions we make. So we could track towards this really high-end scenario, or we could flatten the curve. So that's terminology that's really rapidly entered people's Zoom meetings. I hear it a lot when I'm running around Mount Ainslie and Mount Majura, is people talking about flattening the curve, and we all have an understanding of that being reducing the impacts and severity of the COVID crisis. But we also have a emerging crisis that we've just lived through in terms of climate change. So we have decisions to make. We're roughly here. My kiddo is now 2.5, and we still have the opportunity to reduce the severity of future climate change by taking the low emission scenario rather than hitting the end of the century by tracking very high in terms of how global temperatures will change. So this is within my daughter's lifetime, and I wanted to show this to really sort of prompt that discussion around how there are some parallels between these two crises that we've experienced, and how anything that we can learn in terms of the way expertise is received from the COVID crisis is so important in terms of climate change, because climate change hasn't stopped, it hasn't gone anywhere. And from those screenshots and newspaper reports that I showed, you can see that this is as important as ever, that scientific expertise around climate change actually infiltrates the people making decisions. So I'll leave that there and I'll hand back over. If I can, stop share, there we go.
Sophie,